Awesome. Well, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the event series on exploring whiteness and for cultural liberation and I for pronouns. We are so glad that you decided to participate in today's dialogue on an important topic that will lead us in dismantling white supremacy and identifying the barriers to genuine relationships across differences. I would like to thank Jackie Mary Arias, the Director of the Center for Cultural Liberation, for her leadership and for organizing this important dialogue today. We hope to create a safe and brave space for exploring white privilege and how it can be leveraged to build true allyship with historically marginalized people of color. In the chat, we've shared a very brief survey that will help us divide you into smaller groups after we hear from our amazing guest speakers. Thanks to those who already filled it out, and if you have not done so, please do so now. Today we have two Dominican superstars who have graciously agreed to share opening remarks, as well as facilitators who will help moderate the smaller groups. First, we have Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Precious Porras, and second, we will have University Minister and Coordinator of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Team, Amy Omi. Some guidelines to remember are to share respectfully, listen actively and empathetically, and be willing to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is extremely important when building trust. So we will be dividing groups of BIPOC folks, which are Indigenous and people of color, and groups of white folks. We hope that these affinity spaces with people who share our privilege or marginalized racialized identity will create safe spaces for holding each other accountable, learning how to be effective allies, and healing from trauma. And without further ado, I invite Dr. Porras to share her remarks.
Hey everybody, I am Precious Porras, she, hers. I'll let Amy introduce herself and then we will get started.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Amy. Most of you know me. I use she, her pronouns. And Dr. Precious and I are going to share our social location as sort of a first step in intercultural and anti-racist work. So I'll begin with that and then we'll move into our presentation. So I'm a white, cisgendered, bisexual female in a heteronormative relationship. My partner is half Japanese and half white. Together we're raising two children. I'm a musician and teacher by trade. And I grew up in an Irish Catholic working class family in a predominantly Black and Latinx community. And I'm tied with my mom and my uncle as the first in our family to attend college.
Thank you, Amy. I am a Black, biracial, cisgender female, heterosexual in a marriage with a cisgender man who is Mexican American, and we are raising a Afro-Latina daughter. I've been doing diversity work in higher education for 16 years, first-gen college student, grew up in poverty, and as a Black biracial woman, I grew up in my white family, so I also indicate that I have been socialized into whiteness. So we want to situate this conversation, and I will speak probably quickly, so I do apologize for the speed with which I move, but we have a limited amount of time to get through quite a bit of information. And so please note, there will be a list of resources at the end in which you can access all of this information. But we start with a quote from Robin DiAngelo, who has a lot of amazing resources, including White Like Me and White Fragility, and a brand new book, which I forget the name, I think it's White Niceness. Someone drop it in the chat if you know the name. And so we talk about white fragility, a state in which a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include outward displays of emotion such as fear and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-induced situation. This is how Robin defines white fragility, and we want to recognize the name that some of these things may come up for white identified folks as we move through the conversation. I'd encourage you to sit with those. No feeling is a wrong feeling, but sit with your feelings and analyze those feelings as we move through this conversation. And understand that when I talk about whiteness and white supremacy culture, I'm not talking about any individual person. I am talking about whiteness as a system and the ways in which those systems show up. It's something that's normative and that we move through almost like breathing, right? It's the air that we breathe, it's the water that we swim in if we're fish. Characteristics of white supremacy show up in our organizations every single day, including those of higher education. And we unconsciously use these characteristics, both white people and people of color, as our norms and standards. And that makes it difficult, sometimes impossible, for us to open the door to others and their cultural norms and standards. And other people and cultures are allowed to come in if they adapt or conform or assimilate. And so it's a really great website I'd encourage y'all to visit. Lists these characteristics of white supremacy. I'm not going to have time to address all of them. I've chosen a handful that I think are reflective of the conversation that we're going to engage in today. But again, I want to name that when I talk about whiteness and white supremacy, I am talking about the KKK, but I'm not talking about white supremacy in those ways. And I'm talking about a system of valuing whiteness over other identities, a system of whiteness being the norm or the ways in which we move about and the ways in which guide our very culture that we exist in. Additionally, white supremacy operates in collaboration with other oppressions, and they reinforce and reproduce each other. And that's where intersectionality comes in. Intersectionality coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. If you're not familiar, YouTube Kimberly Crenshaw. There's some really great resources out there on intersectionality. My office has quite a few books if you need to pick up a book. Would like to pick up a book to read more about intersectionality. I've got a ton of resources in my space that I can also share for you. Whiteness is a product of conditioning. So when I say I was socialized in whiteness, even though I'm a person of color, I'm a Black biracial person, I grew up with a single parent mom who was white, and I grew up with my white family with no connection to my Black family. Even though I'm a person of color, I was socialized into whiteness. We are all socialized into whiteness because it's the norm, it's the air we breathe, it's the way we move about life. And so also recognizing these are things that you learn, and so you also have to unlearn and unpack these. A lot of these characteristics show up in for all of us, regardless of whether you're a person of color or if you are a white person. So a few that I want to touch on, again, I can't hit all of them. Fear. I think fear is an important one. We fear not being good enough, not being lovable. And when we're afraid, we get stuck and we can't move. White supremacy and white supremacy culture and racism are all fear-based, and they're used as a way for us to disconnect from each other, to connect across racial groups or even within racial groups, to disconnect from ourselves. White supremacy culture, and racism use fear to divide and conquer, always to serve with the profit and power for the few at the expense of the many. It cultivates a fear of not belonging. And so in order to overcome this, and this is very quick, the folks who write about this do it in a much more elegant way. But again, I've got a limited amount of time to touch on these. And so some ways, some antidotes to overcoming fear include, you have to get skilled at meeting your fear so that you're not manipulated by it. That means understanding, sitting with, and naming when fear is showing up for you and what that fear is reflection of. That takes listening to self, understanding self, and really examining these things. And in an everyday process, we may not even recognize those things as fear. We're moving through so quickly, we don't recognize or we can't name something as fear. So it really is about slowing down, which leads me to the second one, which is sense of urgency. And urgency really is about, yes, this work, racial justice work, is urgent. It is important. People are literally dying because we have racial injustice and in many systems, right? With police violence, within our medical system, there is a sense of urgency that must be moved with as we work towards liberation for folks of color and folks with marginalized identities. However, sense of urgency can show up in white supremacy culture, making it difficult for us to be inclusive. Sometimes, in particular, white folks will move with a sense of an urgency and not include people of color in that move. So they'll say, well, we got to do this quickly, so we're just going to respond and do the thing, and you never got input from the community that you're working for. You should always be amplifying voices or advocating for voices. And oftentimes we will move with a sense of urgency because I think that's more important. So when the unthinkable happens and somebody's murdered or there's a bias incident on campus, sometimes the sense of urgency we feel to respond pushes us to move in this this fear, this perfectionist, this defensiveness, and we do it in ways that still uphold and reinforce white supremacy. Also, we can talk about denial, and I think denial is a really important one as we talk about white allyship and what that looks like, because before you can be a white ally, you have to understand how these things show up and how you enforce white supremacy. And again, this also goes for, as a person of color, I can name ways in which I reinforce white supremacy. And I can name the ways in which I've been socialized to do that, and the ways in which sometimes I do that for my own safety. And there's risk for me to not assimilate when I can be in mixed groups. So also understanding the ways in which sometimes I uphold white supremacy for safety, and sometimes I do it for whatever reason, for selfish reasons, to advance my own identity. Denial shows up as defensiveness, and denial show up as defending ourselves when these things happen, or when racial injustice happens, defending other folks. Well, maybe they didn't mean it that way, or maybe that's not what they meant, or perhaps your experience is wrong. And so oftentimes that looks like denying what the person of color is saying, or denying that racism is playing a role in the situation. And it's the refusal or the inability to feel the emotional cost of racism. And I would say, if you're looking for an example of defensiveness or denial, the national conversation around critical race theory is one way that is showing up. Folks are denying that the experiences of people of color have been for generations, and CRT is simply naming those are the ways in which race shows up in systems, but folks are saying no, racism doesn't show up in those ways. Some antidotes to denial, again, this is a very, very quick introduction to some of these characteristics, is being able to name when racism is on target. Understanding deep in our bones that racism is the first step towards repair. And for white folks, it's avoiding taking accusations of racism or collusion personally. Really just sit, if someone has named that you've done a thing that is racist or operates in a system of racism, sit with it and think about it. Don't feel an immediate need to defend yourself, just sit with it and think about it. And then if the person of color is willing to engage in a conversation, asking them, if you're willing to engage and share, can you talk to me about why you're saying this? And if they're not willing to share with you, because we are not required to do that, then it's about finding a place to engage in that conversation, most likely with a white ally. Very quick introduction to a very few of these characteristics, but on that note of white allyship, I will pass it on to Amy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Precious, for that introduction. So one of the things I wanted to talk with us about today is internalized dominance, because this is one of the ways that white supremacy culture manifests itself. And so Aslam Sensoy, who's a faculty scholar in the field of social justice education at Simon Fraser, which is a public research university in British Columbia, Canada. She's written alongside Robin D'Angelo, and together they've broken down this concept of internalized dominance by defining it in this way, referring to internalizing and acting out, often unintentionally, the constant messages circulating in the culture that you and your group are superior to the minoritized group and thus entitled to your higher position. So this shows up in some very real ways, although it's not always intentional, it's showing up. And I'd like to walk us through some examples of how, so that we can begin to recognize it within ourselves as we're doing this work. And I don't have time for a bunch of examples, but I'll highlight three. So first, rationalizing privilege as natural. So this is the idea that it is simply natural for one group to have dominance over another. And often in some of my conversations with people, I've heard people compare human nature to that of like animals, right? Like describing sort of a survivalist hierarchy wherein someone has to be on top, right? And this idea, as we know, is one that has historically been weaponized and has led to genocide. So it's dangerous to think in that way, and inevitably leads to this concept of the hierarchy of human value. Secondly, rationalizing privilege as earned. This is the meritocracy argument, and it's the standard trope within a white supremacy culture. and one that can manifest among white people as well as among people of color. The idea that, you know, I pulled myself up from my bootstraps, I immigrated to this country the so-called right way, or I worked hard to get where I am. So all these statements ignore the ways in which racial privilege is unearned and benefits white or lighter skinned individuals. It also refuses to acknowledge the ways that systems and policies and practices that have been put into place to favor white people have led to inequitable outcomes for people of color, right? So simply looking at the health disparities and higher death rates for people of color during the COVID pandemic is an example of how unearned privilege is operating. And then just this final example for now, we'll send you a document that outlines these further. This idea that, or perceiving you and your group as the most qualified and entitled to the best jobs. This is sort of the flip side of the meritocracy idea of earned privilege, and leads to statements that I've heard, such as, you know, like he or she only got the position as like a diversity hire. You know, they're filling in this, you know, quota, right? Like I've heard white people saying these things within our own institution, and it's harmful because it implies that the person being described hasn't, you know, doesn't deserve the position, and it's demeaning and racist. So these are just a few examples of some of the ways that white supremacy culture manifests in expressions of internalized dominance. And we, as Precious named earlier, we've got to remember that this is the water we're swimming in. We've been socialized, all of us, whether we're Black, brown, or white, to perceive certain ways of being and knowing as more legitimate and therefore superior to others. So at this moment, we need to take kind of a deep breath as we're processing some of this. We'll just pause for the breath. And then I'm going to highlight a couple of tools that we're hoping to utilize in the year ahead for our campus, one of which is white accountability groups. So Lisa Petrov and I participated in a white accountability group in some sessions a couple of weeks ago. One session led by Kathy O'Bear. And white accountability groups are, you know, for people who identify as white or have white skin privilege, to build community, to do our own work, and to critically engage in whiteness and white privilege. And it's this whole idea of holding one another accountable for change, right? It's that actionable change. And so in these spaces, we do exercises and reflections that really call us to recognize how whiteness and white privilege are functioning within us, and to then begin to be able to not only identify, but to interrupt things like internalized dominance as it's showing up in our psyche, right? And then develop strategies for change. So we'll be developing some of that in the next year, and so stay tuned. And then just one other thing I want to share with you, and again, we'll have a page of resources for you, but I wanted to highlight Dr. Craig Elliott II's open letter to us white people in engaging race work. This is a list of expectations for whites who want to do this work. And there's a list of 9, but I want to highlight 2 today, and then you can more fully read about this and go into this for yourself as a self-reflection and exercise. The reminder is that the work is messy, right? It's complex because we're unraveling privilege that is like deeply ingrained within us. And so it's not always easy to recognize right away. So number 1, I'll highlight 2, but number 1 is don't run away. I think often this is what white folks, and I'm speaking from my own positionality as a white person, the immediate response or reaction when we don't feel like the expert or we don't feel like we've got a good handle on things is like, you know, the impulse is to run away. And even right now, as we're engaging with this, some of us who identify in this way may be in our minds, you know, saying, well, I don't run away, like even resisting that, right? And so that's exactly what we're talking about. The moment that we create distance between ourselves and another, or distance from an issue, that's what we mean by running away. So you've got to come at it head on and engage with it, regardless of how uncomfortable it is. It's going to be uncomfortable. And then the next final thing I want to highlight is connection to community, because that's just a reminder of what we're here doing today, you know, with the gracious, excellent leadership of Jackie and Gabby and Precious. So we need to connect to community. We cannot do this work alone. And we're all at different stages in our development. So we need collaborators, we need supporters. In addition, we've got to create communities of folk who are willing to engage in the work with us, right? And we've got to stop worrying about, you know, whether or not we're going to be perceived as white supremacists by creating a whiteness dialogue group, right? Or the other side of that is, you know, the pushback or the resistance that might come from an institution that's, you know, committed to the status quo. You got to let go of that fear and dive in as a community united together. So with that, I need to talk for hours, but I'm going to pass it back over to Precious to help us get ready for our dialogue together.
So as we enter dialogue space, and Gabby named some of these for us, I want to name some community learning guidelines, but I also want to name, again, as Gabby highlighted, we very intentionally split these dialogue groups up into BIPOC folks and white folks, because the work of anti-racism is different for each community. And so we have intentionally done that so that white folks can engage in community about the things that they need to be doing to address anti-racism, and people of color can talk about the things that they're doing. And right, that includes anti-Blackness, but that also includes the ways in which we have upheld white supremacy and how we unpack those things. But also for us, it's about learning what our risks are and being able to support each other in community. So again, we've intentionally split these groups up in this way. As you enter your groups, some guidelines for conversation include be authentic. We all know each other. I would say I would encourage you to be authentic and lean into being vulnerable. These are safer spaces. We can't guarantee safety, but these are safer spaces to engage in these conversations. Use I statements and speak from your own personal experience. Listen respectfully and actively. Make space and take space. So ask yourself why you're talking or why you're not talking. Be as present as possible. Be open to new and different perspectives. Beware and manage your judgments and assumptions of each other. Take risks if it feels safe to your comfort level, and expand and push your comfort level a little bit. Trust intent and name impact. And so regardless of how you've given something, we're going to assume grace. But if what you've said has had deep impact, then folks can name that impact when it's happened to them. And you should accept that that correction should it come to you for the impact that you've, if you've said something. Respect and maintain confidentiality. That one is definitely important so that folks can be authentic and vulnerable in these spaces. So stories stay, but lessons leave. So you can say, you know, from that conversation, I really learned this, but you would never say Precious said A, B, and C. You would say, I learned this in that space. There's always room for growth and learning. As Amy said, we're all at different places and we want to advance the university. And so we need to recognize some folks are further ahead in this understanding of anti-racism and doing this work, and some folks need to catch up, and we have a responsibility to help each other and pull each other forward. Name if you feel triggered. So if something has happened in the space and you feel safe enough to name that, name if you feel triggered. This is an investment. We say that we are an anti-racist institution, and so this is an investment in doing that learning, doing that unpacking, and doing it in community with each other. Trust the process. This is not easy work to do. This work takes, like I said, we can't rush in with urgency. That's one of the characteristics of white supremacy. So trust the process, lean into conversation and engage in conversation. And as much as possible, have fun. We're not saying that conversations about racism are fun, but also this is an opportunity to grow and learn and be in community with each other. And that's one of the most important things I think about our Dominican community. So lean into this and have fun as much as possible. So we have 3 questions for you to discuss in your breakout rooms. How do you resist the characteristics of white supremacy culture? And these will also be in the chat. What are some of your fears as you engage issues of race and racism? And when and where do you get stuck? And how do you feel when you are stuck and less effective?
Okay, so everyone should see the breakout rooms have been opened. You can join your room. If you have trouble, just let me know and I will help you get to your assigned room.
I hope you all had thoughtful and challenging and reflective conversations in your small groups. Thank you all so much for joining today, and a huge thank you to Amy and Dr. Porras for leading us in this important topic. I wanted to end today's session on a quote by Adrian Michael Green. Allyship is a love language. It says, "Tell me what you need. I don't know what to do or what to say, but I am here, at the ready, willing. No criticism, no judgment. If you tell me to do nothing, I will do nothing. If you tell me to speak, I will lift my voice even if the wrong things come out. No more will I be idle. No more will I watch you suffer. I am with you, here to listen, here to fight, here to shoulder and make up for battles I have missed. I may be late, but that won't happen again. Standing, holding, bleeding, mobilizing, unpacking my own biases, my own privilege, full time. I will learn, unlearn, disrupt systems of power. If you will have me or not, I'm doing the work." So thank you all again. Make sure to join us for our last summer dialogue series on August 11th at 2:30 on supporting non-Hispanic students at an HSI. You can RSVP on Engage DU. And just a huge thank you again. May we all continue to learn, unlearn, and disrupt systems of power. Have a great day.